The room was quiet, too quiet for what had just been said. Cameras panned slowly across the panel, faces stiffened. Some looked down, others stared blankly at the microphones in front of them. And then it happened. The name Julius Malema echoed through the Malanga Commission. A man who had built his entire reputation on exposing corruption was now being mentioned in connection to it. 3 weeks ago, I told you to mark my words. I warned that red flags were rising, small details, strange reactions patterns that didn't add up. I said if a third one appears, that's it, Julius Malema is hiding something. And now here we are, the prophecy fulfilled in real time. The very committee he sought to control has now turned into the mirror, reflecting back everything he tried to avoid. Let's rewind for a moment. 3 weeks earlier, Malema stood in Parliament, his voice booming across the chamber. We're not going to be told by Makonazi what must happen. That defiance sounded like power, but it was fear dressed in authority, because when a man insists on closing doors before anyone knocks, you know he's protecting something behind them. Today, that door has been forced open. The Malanga Commission, in its quiet persistence, has begun to peel away the layers. Testimonies have surfaced, links have been named, and the image of a revolutionary fighter for justice is now colliding with the reality of a man entangled in the very system he once condemned. So the question is no longer, who is Julius Malema? The question is, what has he become? Has South Africa's loudest critic of corruption just become its newest symbol of it? Stay with me till the end, because in this video, I'm not just going to show you what happened, I'll show you the red flags that led here, the quiet strategy behind the storm, and why this moment may mark a turning point not just for Malema but for South Africa itself. Press like, stay with me, because what's coming next will change how you see politics forever. When the story began 3 weeks earlier, it didn't look like a scandal. It looked like routine politics, another fiery day in Parliament. Julius Malema, leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, leaned forward at the microphone, his tone sharp and commanding. We're not going to be told by Makonazi what must happen, he said. The chamber erupted in murmurs. To the untrained ear, it sounded like conviction. But for those watching closely, it was a sign of panic disguised as power. That day, the committee was supposed to summon Minister Monazi for questioning a man connected to sensitive contracts and internal leaks. But Malema went out of his way to interfere. He didn't just challenge procedure, he shut down the very notion that Monazi could be summoned. His words. He started this mess, and now he doesn't want to come sounded like accountability. Yet behind the rhetoric was something far more strategic, closing the door of recusal. Political analysts began to notice a strange pattern. Malema wasn't defending the public. He was defending someone, or perhaps defending himself. Even opposition members from the Democratic Alliance raised eyebrows. Why was Malema pushing harder than anyone else to shield the very people under scrutiny? One commentator put it simply, he's not protecting them. He's preempting his own defense. Because the more you look at it, the more it seemed that Julius Malema already knew what was coming. And then came the red flags. The first, his attempt to silence the committee's summons. The second, his unexpected defense of certain ministers and business figures accused of back-channel deals. And finally, the third, the one that would change everything, arrived with the Malanga Commission. On the morning of the commission hearing, General Shibiru, a veteran officer with decades of intelligence service, took the stand. His testimony was calm, methodical, the kind that doesn't need drama to be devastating. Malema, he said, was part of a group of 5 individuals with interests in mining operations in the Northwest Province. The room went silent. For the first time, the dots were being connected, politicians, generals, and private financiers, all circling the same pool of profit. According to the testimony, one of Malema's close associates, identified only as Z, served as the link between political figures and security officials. This Z allegedly had deep ties with General Shibiru and another officer under investigation. It wasn't direct proof of criminal conduct, but it was enough to draw a picture, a network of influence, money, and secrecy. Meanwhile, across town, Malema was not in that hearing room. He was in Parliament grilling another minister as if nothing was wrong. Cameras caught his trademark confidence, the smirk, the hand gestures, the thunderous tone. But this time the performance felt hollow, because while he questioned others, his own name was being spoken elsewhere under oath. The irony was impossible to ignore. The man who made a career out of demanding accountability was now the subject of it. By afternoon, the timing grew almost symbolic. Shabiru's mention of Malema came just before noon. At around 3:00 p.m., Malema in Parliament casually referenced the same general in his line of questioning, as if unaware that at that very moment the dots were already being connected in the public record. Commentators called it a collision of timelines. One analyst said, "It's as if the hunter and the hunted exchanged places without realizing it." By evening, the story began spreading through the networks, and journalists were already piecing together the puzzle. A book long in the making, Malema Money Power Patronage, suddenly climbed back into headlines. It described in detail how money flows through South African politics and how Malema became both a master and a prisoner of that system. What started as parliamentary bravado had become a revelation of self-protection. Julius Malema wasn't just fighting a political battle anymore, he was fighting for survival. The tension reached its breaking point when the recording from the Malanga Commission began to circulate online. A quiet courtroom, a witness under oath, and a voice calmly saying the words no one expected. Julius Malema is part of a group of 5 individuals with mining interests in the Northwest Province. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't dramatized, but it hit the nation like thunder. For years, Julius Malema had built his reputation as the fearless watchdog, the man who spoke truth to power, the unbought, unbossed revolutionary. And now his name was being placed among the very elite networks he'd promised to destroy. That was the moment of collision where the myth met the man. Inside Parliament, the reaction was eerie. Malema was in session questioning Minister Mukunu about sensitive documents leaked to a businessman named Modi. His tone was righteous, his words sharp. You cannot share government secrets with comrades. The irony was unbearable. On one screen, Malema was preaching integrity. On another, his name was being read in testimony, linking him to shadowy mining deals. Even veteran MPs went silent. One member of the DA whispered to a journalist, "He doesn't even know yet." Others exchanged glances, a mixture of disbelief and recognition. They had seen this before, the fall of those who flew too close to the fire. By sunset, the headlines hit. Malema named in Malanga testimony. EFF leader linked to mining interests under probe. Television networks replayed the same few seconds of the testimony over and over, looping the words, "close friend of Julius Malema," like a mantra. On talk radio, callers debated whether this was justice or sabotage. Social media erupted, half of South Africa in shock, the other half saying, "We always knew." The EFF party released a carefully worded statement, neither confirming nor denying, claiming the commission was being weaponized to discredit revolutionary voices. But inside the party ranks, there was visible unease. Senior members reportedly questioned why their leader had been missing from the very session meant to confront General Shabiru, only to appear boldly in later meetings once the danger had passed. Meanwhile, the man himself remained silent. No official press conference, no denial. Just that familiar, defiant silence that once made him appear strong, now making him look trapped. For observers, this was more than a political drama. It was a crisis of faith. Julius Malema was not just a politician. He was a symbol for millions of South Africans who believed that the system could be cleansed from within. When that symbol cracked, it wasn't just his reputation that fractured, it was hope itself. In the following days, as journalists dug deeper, the story grew darker. Connections between business groups, military officers, and party officials began to form a pattern. Even those who still defended Malema were forced to admit something didn't add up. One newspaper headline said it best, "The revolution that ate its children." That phrase echoed through living rooms, radio stations, and social media feeds. The young revolutionary who had once promised to burn down corruption was now accused of feeding it. But perhaps the most haunting reaction came not from his critics, but from those who still loved him. Outside the EFF headquarters, a woman told a reporter, "He was our last hope. If he falls, who's left?" Her voice trembled not from anger but from sorrow. That was the emotional peak of the story. The country wasn't just witnessing a scandal, it was watching the slow unraveling of a movement, one that had turned against its own ideals. As the commentator said in closing that night, the saddest thing about betrayal is not what it does to your enemies, it's what it does to your believers. When the shock settled, what remained was a heavy silence, the kind that hangs over a country when faith begins to crumble. South Africa had seen corruption before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just another scandal, it was a fracture of trust. For years, Julius Malema had embodied the rage and hope of a generation, the voice of the unemployed youth, the disillusioned worker, the forgotten rural poor. His fiery speeches gave them language. His defiance gave them courage. And now his name was being whispered in the same breath as generals' cartels and secret mining deals. The streets did not erupt in protest, not yet, but you could feel the temperature shifting. Taxi drivers, teachers, and shopkeepers all asked the same question: if even Julius is in it, who isn't? That question didn't need an answer. It was an accusation against the entire system. The first civil consequence was psychological disillusionment. When the man who promised to tear down corruption becomes its alleged participant, cynicism replaces hope. In the townships of Soweto, young men who once wore red EFF berets stopped showing up at rallies. In Johannesburg's political cafes, conversations turned from revolutionary zeal to quiet skepticism. Then came the political consequences. Inside Parliament, the EFF's fiery tone softened. Party members avoided direct questions about their leader's appearance in the commission records. Coalition talks with other opposition groups began to freeze. Even among allies, whispers grew. Could the EFF survive without Malema's voice? Within the ruling ANC, however, the scandal brought a strange relief. For years, Malema had been their loudest critic. Now, with his integrity under question, they finally had ammunition. A senior ANC strategist was quoted off-record saying, "He's done what we could never do: discredit himself." Internationally, the fallout was subtle but noticeable. Financial analysts cited growing political instability in South Africa's internal reports. Investors, already nervous about power shortages and unemployment, now feared that even the opposition was compromised. The nation's image as a democracy with moral authority already fragile took another hit. But perhaps the deepest damage wasn't political or economic. It was spiritual. South Africa's story has always been about redemption, from apartheid to democracy, from oppression to dignity. Malema had positioned himself as the next chapter of that story. When his integrity cracked, the myth of moral renewal cracked with it. The commentator captured it perfectly. This is what happens when ideology replaces integrity, when we worship personalities instead of principles. And he wasn't wrong. Because at its heart, the crisis wasn't about one man, it was about how power seduces even the most righteous voices. The same fire that fuels revolutions can burn their leaders from within. Across the country, small community leaders began speaking differently. Pastors preached sermons about honesty over hero worship. University students debated whether revolution without ethics is just another form of tyranny. The scandal had accidentally awakened something rare, a moral conversations the country had been avoiding. In that sense, the collapse of Malema's image became a mirror for the nation. It forced people to ask, what kind of freedom do we really have if our saviors become our oppressors? South Africa now stands at a crossroad. Either it buries another scandal and moves on, or it learns painfully that liberation means nothing without integrity. From across the Atlantic, the story of Julius Malema's unraveling sounded eerily familiar. In the United States, commentators on both the left and right saw reflections of their own political decay, leaders who began as reformers only to become prisoners of their own rhetoric. On American talk shows, analysts drew parallels between Malema's fall and what they called the global fatigue of political messiahs. One conservative commentator in Washington put it bluntly, "South Africa's crisis is not unique. When revolutionaries become comfortable, corruption becomes their new ideology." For older Americans who watched Nelson Mandela's triumph 3 decades ago, South Africa once symbolized moral courage, a democracy born from sacrifice. But the Malema scandal struck a different chord. It reminded them of how ideals once achieved can be eroded not by enemies from outside, but by ambition from within. In the Western press, headlines were cautious but pointed South Africa's populist Starface's integrity test. From revolution to reputation risk, Malema's name surfaces in mining probe. Editorials in The Guardian and The New York Times framed the story as part of a larger continental struggle, a generational clash between two visions of Africa's future. On one side, the politicians who weaponize ideology. On the other, the reformers who are trying to build sovereignty through disciplined work and national dignity. That's where another name began to appear: Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso. American and European analysts started drawing a sharp contrast between the two. While Julius Malema talks of freedom, one analyst wrote, "Ibrahim Traoré builds it." In Burkina Faso, the focus has shifted from slogans to systems, from shouting in parliament to digging wells, constructing factories, reclaiming gold mines, and financing education. It is a vision that older Western audiences find both radical and refreshing leadership that looks like service, not self-preservation. Meanwhile, the African diaspora, particularly in the US, Canada, and the Caribbean, watched with mixed emotions. Many admired Malema as a voice of black pride and defiance, but others began to see him as part of the same broken loop, a cycle of leaders who rise on revolutionary flames and fall in the ashes of ego. On social media, a Ghanaian-American user wrote, "Maybe Africa doesn't need louder men. It needs cleaner men." In think tanks and policy circles, discussions shifted. The question was no longer whether Africa could govern itself, but what kind of governance it would choose. Would it follow the populist model that feeds on anger and ideology, or the sovereignty model that Traoré and the Sahel Alliance are experimenting with, rooted in self-reliance, industrial revival, and national pride? As one retired US diplomat observed, Africa's next chapter will be written by those who can resist both foreign manipulation and domestic corruption. That's the balance America itself once struggled to find. So while South Africa wrestles with disillusionment, the world is watching something else rise quietly in the Sahel, a leadership reborn from discipline, not demagoguery. So what do we learn from all this? That power, no matter how righteous its beginning, always tests the soul of the one who holds it. Julius Malema's name being spoken at the Malanga Commission wasn't just a political event. It was a mirror showing South Africa what happens when revolution forgets its reason, when truth becomes negotiable, and when ideology replaces integrity. Across the world, older generations recognize this pattern. They've seen it before in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, and yes, in America itself. The faces change, the slogans shift, but the tragedy remains the same. When leaders become idols, nations lose their compass. South Africa stands at a crossroads now. It can choose denial, pretending this is just another headline, or it can face the harder truth that liberation without honesty leads to another kind of bondage. The fight is no longer against colonialism or capitalism, it's against the corruption of the human heart. And yet, even in the darkness, there is a flicker of light. In the heart of the Sahel, young leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso are showing that integrity can still lead a nation. He doesn't preach revolution, he practices reconstruction. He doesn't just speak of justice, he builds it brick by brick with the hands of his people. That is the difference between performance and purpose. And maybe, just maybe, Africa is beginning to see that the age of loud men is ending, and the age of real builders is dawning. To my friends watching from America, you've lived long enough to know that every democracy faces its moment of reckoning. The question is whether its people choose comfort or conscience. So let me ask you, do you believe that South Africa can still rise not on speeches, but on truth? Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's model of moral leadership could be the blueprint Africa needs next? Because history is calling again. And this time it will remember not who shouted the loudest, but who stood the straightest. Please share this video if you believe integrity still matters more than power. Subscribe if you believe that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is still worth defending. Because the story of Africa is not finished yet, and neither is the story of those who still dare to believe in its redemption.